They whispered before the plane even took off. Not loudly, but just enough to sting. He's the guy from that scandal. Right. Didn't he used to be a millionaire? Why is he in economy? Elliot James, in a black tailored suit and polished shoes, took his seat in 31C, right between a teenager glued to his phone and an elderly woman by the window. On the lapel of his jacket, barely the size of a coin, was a rainbow pin. Simple, quiet, defiant. A few rows ahead, a couple tried to discreetly snap a photo. Elliot didn't flinch. He was used to this. Fame had taught him silence, and disgrace had taught him dignity. Outside the oval window, the sun melted into the Cape Town horizon. Inside, the air buzzed with that familiar tension only long-haul flights carry shared space. Unknown stories, unspoken judgment. But Elliot's eyes didn't drift toward the whispers. They lingered on the woman beside him. She was perhaps in her 80s, wrapped in a beige coat, a soft white scarf tied neatly around her neck. Her skin was creased by time, but her eyes held something else. A stillness, a memory. Elliot stared, unsure why she seemed so familiar. She didn't say a word, just offered a faint, knowing smile and looked ahead. He nodded politely and reached for the in-flight magazine, pretending to be absorbed in an article about winter destinations. But inside, he was anywhere but here. He was 10 years old again, standing in the rain outside his parents' house with a suitcase and no voice left to plead. He was 17th boy alone in the school library, holding a cassette maybe from a boy who never returned after spring. He was 25, staring at a phone screen lit up with his own name beside words like exposed, shame, and scandal. He had rebuilt his career from the shadows after that, quietly, intentionally, behind the scenes. And now he was going back. Not to prove a point, not even for closure, just for her. The woman who once held him when he had no name, his foster mother, the only one who didn't ask him to be less of himself. The funeral would be private. No speeches, no flowers, just ashes, and a handful of names on a guest list that didn't include family. Elliot hadn't told anyone he was coming. No entourage, no black car waiting at arrivals. Just a single ticket, seat 31C. Someone a few rows up laughed again. Imagine that, the face of $1 billion game, crammed in the back like the rest of us. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. He glanced back at the woman in the window seat. She had closed her eyes, her hands gently folded in her lap. The soft white scarf around her neck swayed slightly with the cabin air. Something about her made him uneasy in a way that wasn't fear, more like recognition, like a shadow of something he had once held and lost, a face he had never seen, and yet somehow remembered. He sat back and closed his eyes too. He didn't know yet that row 31 wasn't just a seat assignment. It was the beginning of everything he thought was buried. And before the wheels touched the ground, the past would come knocking through a letter sealed in time and a name that hadn't been spoken in decades. This story begins not with a scandal or a fall from grace, but with a scarf, a look, and a seat beside a stranger who knew far more than she let on. And in the silence between turbulence and landing, Elliot would hear the truth wrapped in 25 years of waiting. If you've ever been judged before your story began, or felt forgotten by the ones meant to love you, stay with us. Part 2 is coming next on Heart Story. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. Turbulence began as the plane leveled above the Atlantic. Subtle at first, then enough to rattle cutlery and silence conversations. A voice from row 28 called for water. A crying child quieted somewhere far back. In row 31, Elliot sat motionless, eyes on the seat back ahead, but his mind was still on the woman beside him. She hadn't said a word since takeoff, yet her presence felt almost loud, like a story waiting to be heard. The white scarf around her neck fluttered slightly with the overhead air vent. Her fingers, thin and veined, rested calmly on a worn leather purse. The stillness didn't last. A few rows behind, a man with flushed cheeks and alcohol on his breath stumbled forward toward the lavatory. He paused at Elliot's row, squinting as if trying to place a face. Then he chuckled. "Well, if it isn't the Rainbow Prince," he slurred, nodding at the pin on Elliot's jacket. "Thought you people flew private." The words, though lazy and half-drunken, were sharp. The man didn't move on. "You wear that little thing like some metal," he muttered. Louder now, pointing to the pin. "What are you trying to prove, huh?" Heads began to turn. A hush rippled through the cabin, the way it always does when confrontation chooses the narrow aisle as its stage. Elliot didn't look at him. His hand instinctively reached up to touch the pin. He didn't know why. Maybe to protect it, maybe to ground himself. The man leaned closer. "You people ruin everything, even quiet flights." And then, before Elliot could even turn his head, a movement graceful, deliberate interrupted the moment. The old woman beside him stood up. Her body was fragile, but her voice was clear. She positioned herself between Elliot and the man. Her back straight, chin lifted, her hand extended slightly, not to push, but to guard. "This badge," she said, her voice trembling but unmistakable, "was worn by my grandson." Her eyes didn't blink. Her words didn't shake. "He pinned it to his jacket every time he left the house, every time he went to school, every time he tried to be brave." There was silence in the cabin now. Utter, complete silence. The man, still reeking of gin and sweat, tried to laugh, but she wasn't finished. "My grandson died at 15. He left this world after being told, again and again, that he wasn't enough, that his truth was a burden, that his heart was wrong. And when he asked for help, no one stood up." She looked the man directly in the eye. "Don't be the reason another young man decides to leave early." The man stepped back, mumbled something no one cared to hear. A flight attendant quickly approached and ushered him away. But Elliot wasn't watching any of that. He was watching her. Not for what she did, but for what she said. And more importantly, who she said it about. He spoke quietly, almost afraid of the answer. Who was your grandson?" She turned to him, gently took her seat again, smoothed her scarf as if the moment hadn't just split the air in two. "His name was Julian," she said, her voice soft. "He had a quiet laugh, clumsy hands, and eyes just like yours." The words struck deeper than Elliot expected. Julian. That name, it wasn't just a memory, it was the memory. A name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. A name that lived in the quietest part of his story untouched, unresolved. He didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat tightened as the plane hummed forward. Julian. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Somewhere between the turbulence and the silence, Elliot began to feel something rising. Not fear, not grief, but recognition. As if this journey wasn't toward a funeral after all, but toward a truth he never thought would come back. And the woman in the white scarf had just opened the door. The lights dimmed for the evening portion of the flight. Shades were pulled down. Screens glowed faintly in the darkness, casting dull blue reflections on tired faces. Somewhere, a baby cried. Someone snored. But in row 31, time had folded inward. Elliot sat still, shoulders tense beneath the wool of his suit. The woman beside him, this quiet, poised stranger, had just spoken a name he'd buried under years of noise, fear, and forgetting. Julian. He hadn't heard that name since high school. Since the spring semester when a boy with music in his hands and stories in his eyes had changed everything. Julian had given him a cassette, a hand-drawn game concept, a first kiss in the back of a library between untouched shelves, and then nothing, just a sudden absence. One day he was there, the next he wasn't. No answers, no goodbyes, only whispers, and a silence no one explained. Now, 30,000 feet in the air, his name returned not from memory, but from the mouth of the woman in the white scarf. She reached into her worn leather purse, carefully, deliberately. as if retrieving something sacred. "I never found him," she said, eyes still forward. "The boy this was meant for." She placed a small envelope into Elliot's open hand. It was old, yellowed at the edges, sealed but softened with time, and on its front, in careful cursive, it read, "For Elliot, if she ever finds him." Elliot's breath caught. His fingers trembled slightly. The handwriting was familiar, looped, slanted, too large for the small space. He hadn't seen it in over 2 decades. But he knew it was real. "He gave it to me the day before," she continued, voice quieter now, as if the memory itself had aged. "He told me he'd written something for someone who changed his life. Someone he never got to say goodbye to." Elliot stared at the envelope. His own name, untouched by years, waited for him like a doorway never opened. "He asked me to keep it," she said, eyes now meeting his. "And I did. Every move, every year, every time I cleaned out a drawer, I kept it. I didn't know what else to do. Until today." He didn't speak, didn't open it. Not yet. He held it gently, as if afraid it might vanish, or disintegrate like something too good to be real. Julian's name echoed in his chest. That afternoon in the school library, the way Julian laughed, too loud for someone so quiet. How his fingers had lingered just a second longer when passing the game notebook. How his eyes, that day, had looked like they carried more than they could say. And now this letter, this small, trembling bridge between past and present, sat in his palm, warm from the hands of the only person who had never stopped carrying it. The cabin remained dark, but something had shifted inside Elliot. The man who had boarded with silence now held a voice he didn't know was waiting for him. He placed the envelope inside his jacket, over his heart. Not ready yet, but grateful. Heavy with something he couldn't name. The woman beside him leaned back, folding her scarf over her lap. She didn't ask if he would open it. She didn't need to. They both knew some truths don't arrive when they should. They arrive when we're finally ready to carry them. The hum of the aircraft became a steady background rhythm, soft enough to fade beneath thought, loud enough to remind everyone that they were still suspended somewhere between continents and, for Elliot, between lives. He didn't open the letter right away. It stayed where he had placed it, inside his jacket, pressed to the left side of his chest, but his fingers kept drifting back to it, as if checking it hadn't disappeared, as if it might slip away like the boy who'd written it. Julian. The name was now more than memory. It had weight, breath. It had traveled with him all these years in silence, and now it was here waiting to speak. He finally unfolded the flap under the dim reading light, careful not to tear the edges. The paper inside was soft from age but untouched, like someone had written it and never dared to read it again. There were no dates, no greetings, just a voice, captured in ink. "If you're reading this, it means my grandmother found you. It means something good happened after I left, which I hope so much. I don't know how to write this. Elliot, you were the only person who made the silence feel safe. When I gave you that game concept, I wanted it to mean something. And when you kissed me back, I started to believe maybe this world wasn't a mistake. But the world around us wasn't ready, and I wasn't strong. That day in the library, our last, I wanted to say goodbye, but they pulled me out of school. Just like that, 1 hour to pack, no explanations, just gone. They said I'd start over, that I'd forget, that you were a phase I didn't fight hard enough, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know what your life looks like now, but I hope you kept creating. I hope you built something. I hope you stayed you. And if you didn't, if you had to hide for a while, I hope this letter finds you in the moment you're ready to come back. I loved you, even if just for a spring, even if I wasn't allowed." Elliot didn't cry. He sat still, the letter on his lap, his hands folded over it like a prayer. Outside, clouds streaked past the window like chalk across black velvet. The flight attendants walked quietly between rows, offering coffee, tea, something warm, but he didn't notice. Julian had written the words Elliot had needed back then, but never received. And now they reached him not too late, but right on time. Elliot looked over at the woman beside him. She wasn't watching him. Her eyes were closed, her breathing steady, hands resting peacefully on her scarf, as if this flight, this act, had given her something too. He leaned closer, speaking not to wake her, but to thank her. "Thank you for not throwing it away," he whispered. She didn't reply, but one corner of her mouth lifted gently. It was enough. The captain announced the descent into Cape Town. Passengers stirred, belts clicked, window shades lifted one by one, but Elliot didn't feel like he was arriving. He felt like he was remembering who he had been before silence, before hiding, before shame had carved itself into his posture. The boy who once kissed Julian in a dusty library now sat 35, successful, alone, but no longer unfinished. He folded the letter, placed it back inside the envelope, and tucked it safely in his jacket again. A different man than the one who boarded. And as the wheels touched down, Elliot didn't look back. He looked forward. There was still a funeral to attend, still ashes to scatter. But something had shifted. He hadn't come back to bury the past. He had come back to carry it forward with the name that had once made his heart race, now stitched into something greater than memory. The wind in Cape Town carried a salt-tinged stillness that reminded Elliot of endings and beginnings. He left the airport without a driver, without press, without the kind of notice he used to command in another life. There were no fans waiting, no cameras, just silence, the kind he now welcomed. He didn't go to the hotel. He didn't attend the dinner someone had organized for distant relatives and colleagues of his mother people who once smiled at her in public, but never visited her home. Instead, Elliot asked for directions to an address scribbled on a card the old woman had given him before they parted ways at baggage claim. A modest brick building stood at the end of a quiet street, worn but cared for. A children's hospital, filled with soft sounds, wheelchairs rolling, cartoons humming faintly behind closed doors, the murmur of nurses moving room to room. Elliot stood at the entrance for a moment, his hands in his pockets. Before stepping in, he asked for the matron by name. The receptionist smiled and pointed him toward a quiet wing. She was waiting there, Charmaine, the woman from row 31. No scarf this time, just a plain blouse and the same dignified eyes. He handed her a folder, already signed, already processed. "This is everything," he said softly. "Full proceeds from the new game, global launch, merchandise rights, streaming partnerships. It'll keep this place going for years." She opened it slowly, read the name at the top, Julian Ellis Foundation, for LGBTQ+ youth affected by school-based violence and family rejection. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Later that week, the story spread quietly at first, then fast. A game developer had donated his entire year's profit. The game, titled Ellis: A Story You Forgot, featured a protagonist with dark hair, warm eyes, a white scarf around his neck, and a name that no one had expected: Julian. In the game, he wasn't tragic. He was bold, brilliant, soft-spoken but full of light. A character who helped others find their voices by facing the shadows inside his own story. No one on social media could agree why the scarf detail mattered, or why the opening screen showed a quote, "Some truths wait until we're ready." But Elliot knew, and so did the woman who sat on her porch that night, the glow of the TV flickering through her window as a trailer played again. She watched the character speak, watched him hold the pin Elliot still wore, watched the world remember a name she had never stopped whispering in prayer. She closed her eyes, breathed out, and smiled. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive loudly. Sometimes healing doesn't roar. It just returns quietly, faithfully on the wings of a flight that was never about where you're going, but about what you're finally ready to carry home. Have you ever received something years later that arrived exactly when you needed it? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Heart Story for more stories that find you when you're ready to listen.